Welcome to Smart Branding, a podcast dedicated to branding, naming, and domain names. I'm Tatiana Bonneau, and with my guests, we try to help you create and grow strong, memorable, and meaningful brands online. I believe time is one of our most precious assets, and so I want to thank you in advance if you decide to spend the next 30 minutes with us. I promise to do my best to make those worth it. Let's go! So today my guest is Aaron Hall. He's the Group Director and Naming Expert at Siegel+Gale, one of the top brand strategy and design companies globally. Hello, and thank you for joining us, Aaron. It's a pleasure.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Let's start with a bit of a background. Give me a bit of an idea and our listeners about who you are and how did you get into naming?
Yeah, I moved to the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area, in the last year or so of the dot-com boom. So I worked at a kind of some dot-com-esque marketing companies for about a year and a half. And then everything fell apart. all the tech companies and all the marketing agencies kind of went away. About a year later, I stumbled on a job posting on Craigslist for a naming job as a marketing role at a naming job. And I didn't know what that meant, but it sounded interesting. I knew I got to play with words. That's all I knew. And I'd always enjoyed writing and languages. So I applied, I got the job, and that was 22 years ago. So I have been naming things ever since.
Wow. I love that. And you're not my first guest that works in naming, but I find it fascinating that oftentimes the story is like that at the beginning. It's like, so I didn't even know what it is, but I got into it.
The number one response I get when someone says, "What do you do for a living?" And I say, I come up with names for companies and products. It has to be 80% of the responses is first, "That's so cool." And second, "I didn't know that was a real job."
Yeah. I think now I saw there was recently, I don't know, let's say recently, there was post that went viral about some teenage girl. I think she was making like a fortune naming babies. Oh. So I think, it's in a way, it's very interesting that, people still go, is that a job? And then like you look around, everything has a name. So
I've written a few blog posts over my time on how you could take some of what I do, the processes and the do's and don'ts for product and company naming, and how you might apply that to baby naming. And one of them was very popular because I think the most popular piece of advice was, don't tell people your baby name until the baby is born. You might tell them the ones you're considering, but inevitably, and I've seen this happen firsthand, you say, "Oh, we're considering this name and this is the name," and people will react badly. They just our natural inclination when it comes to naming, whether it's naming a baby, naming a company, if you tell the person, "Oh, we're thinking of naming it this," our brains just go to this critical, why isn't that a good name place? So that's the advice I gave for naming babies is keep it close to the chest until if you introduce the baby as, "Oh, here's beautiful Elizabeth," everyone was like, "She's such a cute Elizabeth." But if you say that before, you might get something like, "Oh, isn't that like the Queen's name? Isn't that an old person's name?" It's just the negative reactions will come if you do it that way.
What about company naming? Is that similar? What sort of a do's and don'ts do you have?
So I think the company naming is just probably one of the hardest types of naming to do of all the things I can name in my job. And I think partly it's that you have to, with all corporate naming, you have to find something that is available as a trademark. But with company naming, it's particularly challenging because there's so much identity wrapped up in a company name. So the CEO or founder, this is their baby. This is, what you name it reflects on them. It's part of their identity as well. Not to mention, if you're renaming a company, that name is going to be the identity for employees. It's going to be a rallying cry. It's going to be something that, you introduce yourself at a mixer or even just a, personal event. "Oh, my name's Aaron. I work at Siegel+Gale." That becomes part of who I am and part of my identity. So I think company naming in particular is the one where we put a lot more effort and time into trying to bring people along psychologically. with the name ideas and the name options. And I think it takes a little longer typically at the end to pick the right final name. With product naming, I just, by and large, it tends to be a little more quicker at the end for people to pick between a few finalist names. And I think company naming, people think a lot longer and harder, and maybe sometimes have more stress and anxiety about which one to pick.
What is the process like when people come up to you for a name?
Sure. Yeah, it's a pretty traditional creative or consulting process. Kick off 2 rounds of creative and 2 presentations. But I think where naming starts to get a little different is in that kickoff, at least the way we do it, we try and not ask traditional consulting questions like, what themes do you want the name to say? What do you not want it to say? Et cetera. We try and use exercises that get at what people's hopes and wants are. So if you were explaining this to, this new company or this new product to your grandma or an older relative, how would you explain it in very easy to understand terms, right? And when we get at questions and exercises like that, we start to see what's different or unique about it without the jargon and the lingo and the vocabulary we use in the business world. So we really try and use that kickoff. And if it's a company name, we really need that CEO or founder to be there because their input is so important. And so that's the kickoff. That also, I tend to see names as there's this long discussion about whether names are strategically creative or creatively strategic. I very much believe naming is more like an art form. Of course, it takes inputs into account. But if you try and limit an artist, if you commissioned an artist and said, hey, only use the colors blue and green and shapes that are square, you're going to get exactly what you told them. But if you say, paint me something that fits the vibe of my house, right? And you have them walk through your house and see what you're like, you might get something really unique and special and creative. And so that's what we try. That's how I see names is I want to get a sense for you and the company and what you do or your services. And then, the world is our oyster. We don't know where the naming is going to take us until our fingertips hit the keys and we start exploring and we have all sorts of processes to go explore different creative ideas to really think outside the box. So we will come up with hundreds and hundreds of names that first round of creative that explore every single possible thing we heard and some things we didn't in that kickoff. Then we narrow that to about 100, 150, and we do a preliminary trademark screen, right? So we make sure.
That's a lot of names.
It's a lot of names. It's a very cursory screen. So it's not going to tell you the name is available, but it will tell us which names aren't available, right? Very clearly, you cannot use these. Don't show these to the client. Why would you do that, right? They're not going to be able to have. So that usually ends up with about 30 or so that we can take back and say, here's a few that do this. Here's a few that are made up. Here's a few that, start with this letter you liked. Here's a few around this theme. And inevitably there's 3, 4, or 5 that a client tends to like. And there's some new ideas that pop up for them in that meeting. Oh, well, now that you showed us what speed was, we don't like the speed theme, but what we do like is acceleration, right? Or we like innovation instead. And so new themes will pop up. And so we do a second round, a little more focused, a little smaller. And we do the same process, create a bunch of names, pre-screen some, and show another round. That usually gets us to a list of 10 at the end. That we can do different types of vetting. So whether it's quantitative research, linguistic screening, and then their team does a full legal search on those 10. And at the very end, if we do all of those, usually there are 3 or so that look pretty solid. Their audience likes and understands the trademark counsel, the trademark lawyer says these look like you could have them, et cetera. So and then the final choice, it really depends. Sometimes the clients include us on that and like our counsel. Sometimes it's very personal and they just want to make that choice at the end. But, that's about a 6-week process, 6 to 7 weeks with that legal and the rest at the end as well.
I have so many questions now.
Sure.
One is because at the beginning you mentioned that you really need like the CEO, the founders, even the team involved in the process. How do you be, and it's also a very creative process on your side. How does it work? Because from for example, from my experience before I got into domain names, I was in IT, building software websites. And there was that huge issue that I still now have with domain names, where there's a mismatch between what the founder, and sometimes even depending on the size of the company, members of their team or different departments, what they feel is the right choice and what the audience is actually needs or wants.
Yeah.
How does that work with naming?
Well, there's a couple of pieces there to that, a couple of ways to answer that. So the first is with company names, the reason why we want to include that CEO or founder so early on is we want to have them feel like they have told us from their mouth to our ears what they hope the company name or the company to accomplish, what they want it to be, right? So that when they see names later, they go, right, those things I said are reflected in these words I'm seeing. I could show the same set of names to a CEO but not have them participate in that kickoff, and their reaction will be, well, they didn't hear what I wanted this to be. So they may not like the names. So that's part of the psychology. To the second part of your question, what happens when the CEO feels very strongly and maybe their team or some research says that the audiences don't? Mostly what we find is the team, in those cases, the team tends to think, well, our audience, our customers want this other thing, and she wants this other theme. We have a great quantitative research study that was built by branding researchers here at Siegel+Gale to go do research on those finalist names with your exact audience. I won't get super deep into it, but it uses monadic testing. And in 22 years, I've seen some terrible naming research until I got here, where this actually tells us which names say the things and communicate the emotions and the personalities and the attributes we care most about. We want the name to signal. And it tells us which names do it best, which names do it so-so, and which names do it at all. And so when we bring that kind of research to a CEO and say, we know your favorite name was this one, but look, it's in the bottom rung. No one gets it. And in fact, it may have some challenges. Like, people might not think it is innovative or quick or whatever that thing they wanted to say. Whereas these other three names that you were so on, your audiences will really resonate with. So that research tends to help bring them along. There's been probably 25-30% of the time where a CEO will still pick a name in the middle tier of that research because it still does some good things, and it's just the one they have a lot of heart for. And that's okay, because you can support it, because naming isn't the brand. There are brand elements that you can bring along. Maybe you need to take a name and give it more speed through the visual identity. Maybe you need to tell a warmer tone or a human tone through the brand story. So there are things you can do to support a name that isn't exactly everything you needed it to be. So we see that happen too, but it's pretty rare once someone's engaged a naming company that the CEO just vetoes it all. It's happened once or twice in my career.
Yeah, well, I'm sure I have some examples myself with that, but I think we all have those.
Yeah.
So who is your typical client? Like, who could reach out to you? And no, that's going to be another question. Let's just stick to that.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think typically at our company, we have marketing folks of any level, often VPs or CMOs will engage us from bigger companies. At smaller companies and medium-sized companies, it can be just, any person on the brand or marketing team, often a founder or a CEO. We tend to not do a ton of work with startups lately, but in my past, I've done so much startup work, I couldn't even keep up with it. And that's almost always a founder or a CEO who reaches out. The one thing, like I said, is when we get into those bigger companies, and if we're doing a company name, it becomes almost a prerequisite of mine that we get to talk to the CEO. But as for industry, we at Siegel+Gale and I have named almost every industry, whether it's descriptive naming, really straightforward naming, creative naming, energy, healthcare, finance, tech, B2B tech, I could go on and on. You name it, we've probably done some naming in it.
Are there any specific do's and don'ts that apply to different industries or even like locations, or is there something like that when it comes to naming?
Yeah, with do's and don'ts, there are a couple of things with regard to industries. So I think you want to be cautious not to name to a naming fad or trend in that industry, because it will probably not help you differentiate. And also those trends tend to go away. There are a few notable exceptions. Cloud, about 10 years ago, everyone thought it would be a trend. No one wanted to use it because they thought, well, it'll just be gone. And here we are. It is still the dominant term for that industry. But by and large, you want to avoid things like, the lowercase e in front of names. And that was such a fad that, they also date you. Those fads, if you use them in your company name, make your company from a certain time. So if you named it in 2005, you will sound like a 2005 company if you use that trend. There are also things that we want to often make sure people do, which is make sure people can pronounce it and it doesn't have negative connotations. This is especially true if you're going to be a global company. And we also have a linguistic screening sort of test that we can do alongside that quantitative study I was talking about that can go reach any language across the globe and ask real people in those countries, how easy is this to pronounce? Does it make you think anything negative? Are there any brands that this might be related to in your country or your language? And that really is that disaster check to make sure you don't launch a name and find out, oops, it means it's like a sacred religious thing or something in this country that you just kind of made a faux pas. But I think the do's and don'ts by industry really gets pretty specific. But the largest one is just kind of avoid those trends that you see a lot of your competitors, especially smaller startups, tending to do, because those will pass, and then you'll be stuck with a name that is kind of out of date.
Absolutely. I do say that often when I speak to entrepreneurs when it comes to naming, and I did as well with websites and software, that I feel like people sometimes when they're starting a business, they don't dare thinking too much ahead, but you have to and I feel naming is very, very much, or should be at least, influenced by that, because you see so many people boxing themselves, like you say, either to a certain timeline, so they're like always going to be obviously in that time, or even like adding words that make them stuck in an industry or in some geographical location thinking. I mean, you never know, you might not even plan for expanding in whatever service or product or geographical area, but it may happen, and it's so much harder to rebrand the bigger you get.
I think you make some great points about starting a company, naming a company as you start it. That's a very different task than renaming a big company or naming a product that's from a company that exists. And there are some do's and don'ts there that are a little different. So one thing I say is, if you're in the early stages, it's you and a business partner. My advice typically, and I get asked by a lot of friends who are starting up something here in the Bay Area, have been asked over the years. I often say, just pick a code name for now and build out what this is going to be. Determine what you're going to offer, how it's going to be different, who your competitors are going to be first. And then once you have some there, then look into creative naming for it. And that is in part so that, to your point, when you first have the idea, it's about usually a service, a product. And if you name that service or product, and I've been asked to rename so many companies who named their company after a service or a product. 2 years later, they have 3 products. What do we name the company we need to rename so that this product name can stay as it is? So that, I think you make a great point. Like, don't box yourself in. One of the greatest examples of this, I think, is Amazon as a name. They started out as a bookseller. Had they been books.com or Books Inc., right? Bookstore.com. Could they be what they are today without rebranding? Absolutely not. Right. And so I think however that name came into being, and there's a lot of different folklore around that. It was such a great name because when you think about the Amazon, it's this place of rich diversity of life and bioculture, things move quick. The river itself moves quickly, so it gives you that metaphor of speed to get your products. I'm not sure that was all what they planned, but it certainly was a great metaphor that did not box them in and has let them expand in any direction they want over time. So that's another thing. And then finally, for startup founders, one thing I often have to help clarify, and this is related to the work you do, is your .com. If you can get the .com, doesn't mean you can own the name, right? So the first thing you have to do is, if you've found your name or found a name you like, and it looks like there's a .com available, go check that you can own the trademark first, right? And that someone may own a trademark, but they may not have the .com, and they still have legal rights to that word in your space if they've owned it. So I think a lot of folks think that the .com means ownership of the brand, of the trademark, and so they're two very related things. So we just want to make sure people do both instead of just the .com, because I think we were chatting about how you could theoretically go spend some money on a .com and then find out later, oh wow, I forgot to trademark and now I can't even use this word, right? So that's the piece of advice I give new company founders.
You just mentioned you get a lot of people asking you about how to name a product or a service of a new company. At what stage should someone come to you or somebody like you for advice on naming? Like we just said, if they're just starting out, it's better if they define a bit more their product, their service, and get some traction. When is it best to come and ask for advice on that?
Yeah, I think once you have sort of a business plan and also a roadmap for the future, 3-5, you've done some really big blue sky thinking about if you're successful, what could this be one day? And you probably have a few people working for you under, new name.llc, just a code name.llc, whatever it is. So that there's real work going on. You've built some movement toward the product. And then, I think then it's a good time to start exploring what name ideas can be, because I've done it before that. I have helped friends before that. Before they have all of that, they just have the idea. And what happens is I'll serve them up some great name ideas, but what are we comparing them to? It's hard for them to latch on to any of those as great names, because in their head, all they're comparing it to is their passion for this idea, not what the idea will become. How will it play out? Who does it need to reach? Who's the potential audience? How could it evolve one day? Once you have those ideas that you can then put these names up against, those become your criteria. So that's the kind of difference, is that you have some real business plan and some future thinking about and some actual real product or service development to be able to then compare these names against. And I say that's the time to kind of start to reach out to a naming and branding company.
Yeah. So in a way, I feel it's similar to premium domain names, where there's a stage at which there are exceptions. I feel the exception, and very likely, correct me if I'm wrong, that could be in your case as well, where you have like third, fourth, fifth time founders who are starting a thing, but they know very clearly where they're going with it, right, what they're doing. That's a bit of a different story. But for first time founders, I feel, you have to have some real life experience for that company to even have some substance that you can use to create that name. And then in my case, to justify the investment in that premium domain name.
Right. The challenge, right, is, and I've experienced this with friends, their energy and passion and excitement around this new idea is palpable, right? They need to call it something. They want to tell their friends about it. And so that name becomes almost the most important part for them, when, just having done this long enough and helped a few do it more the right direction, helping them determine what the brand could be, where they want the brand to go, which includes who it's for, what its story could be, where it could evolve, what other things they might offer one day. When you start to figure all that out, the name comes second or third, but it's also a much richer experience for them. Yeah, that's just been my experience, is trying to push people to wait a little, even though their energy is so frenetic, right? And they just want to do the thing and have a name and tell the world about it. It's like, okay, press pause, build out your thing a little bit more, give it a cool code name that you can't have, but then approach the branding and the naming once you've got a little bit more to say.
That's a great advice. What about domain names? I can't not ask that question. Where we did sort of outline the process of how you come up with a name. Is the domain name a consideration, and if so, at which point? And what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, we've seen a lot of shift in the last probably decade around domain names. Sure, everyone still needs a domain name. Most people still want a .com. I don't think we're ever going to away from that being the premium real estate, right? But we've seen a couple things. So if you say you will only choose a name if it has the exact name plus .com, you have limited your world of name options to a very, very small set. Now, that's okay. You can do that if you have some money to spend on getting those that are probably already registered. But a few areas we've seen diverge is people are willing to add an industry term. So new name health.com, new name bank.com, right? We've seen that. So one of the things I was saying also is it really does depend if the client or the company does some e-commerce on the site. I do believe if you're going to do e-commerce, you probably do need that .com, that exact .com. Adding a word gets a little tricky. We've done it just because they have a great name and we find a great name and we have to add a word. But usually for something that's going to do e-commerce directly with customers, we do recommend that exact.com. With other clients in other industries, so a B2B tech company, a B2B healthcare company that doesn't even, it's not a customer, a patient-based client, things like that, we do often start to add those industry modifier words to help them get that domain. And then I think one of the things we've started to see is a slight bit more openness to those new TLDs. It's definitely something that I'm developing an opinion about still as I see it evolve. I think it's right for some clients and customers who have a certain kind of audience who understand that .app or .fun or .kitchen, those are all potential TLDs. I don't think we're there yet where it's going to be it's going to take over 50% of the domain business. I think it's growing and it's evolving and people becoming more aware of it, but .com is still the thing we get asked the most about.
I do feel it's very much like earlier we were talking about the naming process, and you mentioned when choosing a name, there's so many things that you need to take into consideration. There's the brand story, the owner, the team, the audience, all the research that you have. And so ultimately, when you end up with that, short list of 5, 10, whatever names there is to choose, all of them have, ups and downs. And you said it better than I'm going to say it now, but it was in a way you're going to have to, in any cases, support that name with all the other marketing that you do, and it's just part of that brand. So I feel it's very much the same, you can say, applies to the domain name. So obviously, yeah, if you have the budget and you get the exactbrandmatch.com, that's probably the best option. But in other cases, and there are other considerations, you mentioned different audiences, different budgets, target markets, etc. You can have different names that you're going to build up in different ways with different elements of your branding and marketing.
Yeah, and we actually did a very interesting. So we had a client who needed wanted a .com, exactword.com. And we also did that quantitative research. Their legal team did their deep dive, and we did linguistic screening. So we created a really interesting chart for them that showed their 10 finalist names, how they did in the quantitative research, whether they were top tier, mid tier, or low tier, how the linguistic screening went. So there was only one that was just unpronounceable in some other key markets. The other 9 looked mostly fine. And then what was the domain status? Several had .coms that could be purchased. 2 were actually, because we were looking at Latin-based coin new words, 2 had domains they could just buy or register that, as that day if they wanted. And a few of their favorites actually ended up having names that they would have to add like finance to or something like that, right? And so we just created it, and it was a nice way for them to see that if they wanted to go with their favorite name, it was a mid-tier in the quantitative, fine in linguistics, legal said it was good, but they would have to add a modifier to it versus a name that was, there was actually one that was in the top tier that had all the great things. And so that was the one they went with. But there was a mid-tier name that was literally best on everything, right? Except originally, they had kind of been iffy on it, and it just like the customers were like, yeah, it's good. Like they get it. It's certainly above the line. And so that definitely was in consideration at the very end because it could have the .com. Linguistics was great. And quantitatively and legal was great, and quantitatively it was like good. And so I think that domain name certainly made it interesting to them that they could have it. So it's another consideration. Again, they didn't do e-commerce on their site, but it was just very important to the CEO that they have that .com.
So we mentioned like different TLDs becoming more popular and fitting for different industries in the past, let's say, 10 years. What other trends have you noticed in namings? What do you find is interesting? Like the obvious artificial intelligence, and what else is impacting that?
Well, I am writing my POV on AI naming. So there's a bunch of pieces out there right now about how to use AI in the creative process. I have plenty of thoughts on that. It's not very good at naming, by the way. It's actually pretty terrible. But you can use it to expand your themes you're exploring. You can use it to expand your exploration. But I'm actually starting to write a POV on when and how should you name your AI technology, your AI company, your AI bot, whatever it is. Much like we already talked about, I think there's a time at which and a feature level at which you should start to brand it, and a feature level at which below the line, you should just say parent company name plus AI. Because there's no reason to brand something that's not truly differentiating. So AI, I think we're going to see an explosion just right here in San Francisco of AI technology in the next year. And I think, I'm working on putting the sort of some thoughts together about some advice to people who are starting an AI technology startup or an AI project within a bigger company of how to name and brand that and when. Another one we've seen and we expect to see a lot of in the coming year, and we've seen a lot of, is mergers and acquisitions. We just did a research study, a data mining study really, on all the M&A in, I think it's 4 industries for over a 3 or 4 year period. And we had a hypothesis that we would see, because we get hired to help name those mergers often, or those acquisitions. So we thought we'd see, we were looking at specifically whether there was a name change or a visual identity change or none. And we thought we'd see a pretty high number. And we were surprised to see it not at all. It's like 5 and 6% at best in one of the industries of name change or brand change. And so we have some thoughts on that. We're working on, I think we posted 2 of the 4 pieces, but I think we're going to see a lot more of that. And it's interesting to know that, in fact, a name or brand change, or name or visual identity change is pretty uncommon as far as M&A goes. And then I think the one we're going to just continue to hear more about, it started, my very first job in San Francisco was working at a youth marketing company who had kind of formed up around the idea that Gen Y, now millennials, just reacted and responded to marketing and advertising differently. So you had to build things that engage them, that weren't just like fluff pieces that disappeared because they would just not think about them. So millennials started this trend of, there's this group that reacts to all marketing differently. Now Gen Z, I think soon to be Gen Alpha. So we did a study, a naming study about a few years ago called Naming for Generations, where we looked at whether Gen Z, millennials, Gen Xers, of which I'm a part, and boomers, if they reacted to different kinds of names for a couple different kinds of products that we created differently. Did some like edgy names? Did some like more straightforward names, etc.? And while we weren't, I mean, one of our hypotheses was that the younger generations would like the hipper, cooler, edgier names. And that bore out to be true. And older generations tend to like things that just say what it is, help them engage. But those edgy creative names we had for a few of our product ideas that we put out there were the most popular with Gen Z, but also the least popular. So it's almost like if you're going to go into an edgy, hip, cool, creative name, you better get it right. Because if you miss the mark, if you don't understand them and put out a name that you think is cool and edgy as a, Gen Xer, and some Gen Z person goes, hey, old man, you don't understand me, right? It will bomb. And so that was one of the more interesting findings. So I think we're going to see more and more of that as Gen Z becomes even a bigger market share, spender. And then as Gen Alpha approaches, I think there'll be a whole new sort of generation to understand how they approach naming and branding, et cetera. So a bunch of different trends we think about.
Yeah, I found that very interesting looking at my kids, which are, even though I have 4, they're not statistically representative of all kids, but it's I find it very, like, they do things and I'm like, they're so different. Yeah. It's very interesting. Like my eldest, when he goes buying things, the amount of reading, like he would even get his phone and Google like that brand if it's not a name that he knows before, and it's not even about the look of obviously, I guess that's what catches his attention. Like if you're buying clothing, but it's what that brand stands for, what's like their history, who's the CEO. And on the other side, I think we were walking around in a commercial center once, and I was like, oh, look, those things look good, and they looked like something he would buy. He was like, looks at it, and it's just like, that name, and I don't remember the name, and I don't want to insult the brand even if I did. He was like, that sounds like it's for old people.
Yeah,
and that was it. He wouldn't even walk into the shop.
Yeah. Well, I think you're touching on a few things. I'm assuming they're kind of Gen Z or Gen Alpha. And I think what we're starting to see with the younger Gen Z and the older Gen Alphas is they've grown up in this digital world, which millennials did too, but they're grown up in the digital world where it's almost the post-truth, post-fact world where anything can be said and could be taken as truth by anyone. So I think we're finding that they want to interact with brands that they do some digging on. And so, that's what you kind of commented on as who is the CEO maybe, but then also they're very civic oriented, right? They care about things that maybe as society collapses around them, they care about supporting the things that are good. And so you start to see these younger audiences do their background research on, are they sustainable or do they do good things? And do they have any bad marks against them? Or where do they source it? I mean, I have some Gen Z and Gen Alpha nephews and nieces, and yeah, I'm starting to see them take interest in those things. So aside from the creative part of naming, I think you, as a brander, you have to start to take that into account. Is how do you communicate the essence of what you do and what you care about? Because it's not just, this is a product, here's what it does for you. It's also who we are as a company, what we care about. And that matters a lot to this younger audience.
And it absolutely has to be authentic. I don't think you can buy your way out of anything nowadays.
Yep, they will find out. They're very grown up with iPhones in their hand, right?
Absolutely. There's Victoria's Secret. I think they rebranded recently. I don't know what it's even, because they went off the like sexy skinny girls into the inclusive everything, and now they're going back to sexy. I think, if I got it right, and it's like, what are you doing?
Well, they're to your point that you just made. You have to be authentic. What is your brand? And you can stretch the limits, or kind of stretch your story into new directions, but directions that are believable. We actually, to touch on another research product we have here at Siegel+Gale, it really helps as we're rebranding a company from the strategic side of things, help us understand the company and their competitive set and who is seen as a leader or where they're seen on a bunch of different attributes that matter in that industry. And then also what's a believable shift for this brand we're trying to work on. So we ask different questions to say, if this company did X or did Y differently, is that believable? And what we find is this kind of sweet spot of here are the metrics you could change and are believable and authentic and true about your brand. And there's some you just can't claim. No one will believe it's from you. Even unfortunately, if it is real, there are just some things that customers won't believe, but also some things that just aren't true. So it is the research study really is about identifying things that can help you authentically shift your brand in a way that I think, we were just talking about, is believable and received well by customers if you do decide to kind of evolve your brand.
Authentically shift your brand. I think that's a great way to say it. Last question, I think. You mentioned from the beginning that we actually got into naming because it's creative, and the whole process you described is creative. And we were talking about how, just you say 300 names, like there's so much creativity that has to go into coming up with all of that. And then at the same time, throughout our conversation, you refer to a lot of research that you do. And I think that's what piqued sort of my attention when I was looking at Siegel+Gale's website. And that's what I feel makes it different from a lot of other brand strategy companies that I've discussed with and I've worked with on various projects, is that like you have a huge amount of research and data. Yeah. So how do those two, usually people feel like, research and data is not creative, and then, naming in your case is creative. How does that match?
It's a great question. And you're right, Siegel+Gale takes a fact-based approach to branding. So we want to, the research can be used, we do use it in a couple of ways. There's research we can do at the start of a project to better understand, like I was talking about, the competitive field, or what's potentially possible for your brand, what your customers are needing or wanting from a company like you, so that we are helping build a brand that addresses that while still being true to what your brand is actually going to do. But often brands come to us for a rebrand when they're shifting the way they operationalize or what they offer and what they do. So that's the research that we can do to help discover ideas and themes. And so that feeds into the creative process, right? What we learn gives us insights to themes we can explore for the name, things that matter, things that will be differentiated. And then we do our creative magic. Right. And I'm not saying that there's no strategy involved. Obviously, we've just done a bunch of strategic research. But then my philosophy is that creative naming is all about letting your brain and minds of the team run free and find new connections, build new connections of words, and see what a word could become. Twitter is some interesting metaphor about little birds tweeting and making a little noise, but that can be such a perfect metaphor and almost a re-encapsulation or redefinition of the word as it becomes about short form blogging, right? Which is what originally was. So it's finding those, that's the creative part. That's the art part. Then we can use research again to determine, all right, we've narrowed it down to 10 words that are really artistic ways of expressing these themes that we found potentially in the original research or in the kickoff or in our competitive audit. Here's 10 words that we think really do this in an artistic way. But let's go find out if your customers see that same potential in those words, or your audiences. And that's where that research serves again. So we're using research to inspire and then validate at the end. So it is a nice mix of strategy and creative to make sure that we are not just choosing a cool, wacky, interesting word and hoping it works, right? Hoping your audiences get it. So I think that's how I see the research and the strategy working together with the creative that we do. I think that that's kind of the beauty of name. So in the past, I have worked at naming only firms, and in the last 15 years, I've worked at leading a naming team within a branding agency, and I've loved doing both. What I find so fun and unique at running a naming team within a branding agency is you have all of these different disciplines coming together to inform each other, to inspire each other. So as the research team does their work, and that inspires the brand strategy folks, who then I'm usually sitting in those meetings and learning and seeing where they're going about how they might position this company in a different way, or a new way if it's a new company. And then that feeds into the brand communications, the story, the brand story they tell. That's giving me a lot of ideas for the creative name I can create. Our visual identity, lead, he's starting to see how that, can also help him explore new ways that aren't just repeating the same message, but building as part of the full message. And then finally, we have, digital experience and activation and employee engagement. So helping the brand come to life for employees. So we have all of these things, all of these different disciplines for branding that work together to really create a holistic brand. And I think that's what I've loved so much about working at a branding company, a branding agency, is it's the strategy and the research and the design and the naming and the creative parts all come together to work harmoniously, right? To create that really powerful brand. And so it is a mixture. I just tend to think the actual name creation part tends to be a little more artistic and creative than strategic, but not exclusive of strategy, just a little more artistic in the development of the actual words.
And which is why not everyone can do it. Like I will say,
on that note, I think great name ideas can come from anywhere. I had one project, the founder texted me at 10 at night one night and said, "What about this?" And it was such a cool word. We put it in the process and it ended up being the runner-up. Like it was between that and another name. The other name got selected. But it's the broad exploration, the letting your mind go free, and then finding things that are trademark available, legally available, pronounceable in other languages, et cetera. That's where I think it really gets hard if you're just, a single person trying to figure out how to name your company.
Great. Well, that's been an absolute pleasure, and I'm sure it's going to be very insightful for our audience. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was great chatting.
Thank you for joining us in this episode of Smart Branding Podcast. Feel free to visit smartbranding.com for more information and reach out if you have any suggestions, questions, ideas, or just want to learn more about how a good domain name strategy can help you build a strong and successful brand. See you next time.